information on child brain development. So we either have a behavior problem or we have a disease problem. But there's a third way to understand human beings, and I think the only way to understand human beings. And that may be called a biopsychosocial perspective. One fancy word, biopsychosocial. What does that mean? It means that the biology of human beings is, for a lifetime, shaped by and affected by people's psychological and social relationships. Now, I'll begin by giving you 3 examples of that. So, a whole number of studies have shown now that children whose parents are stressed are more likely to have asthma. So the more stressed the parents are, the more likely the kids to have asthma. And in polluted areas where asthma is obviously more common because the contaminated air aggravates the airways, aggravates the child's breathing apparatus, it's still the parents who are stressed whose kids are most likely to have the asthma. Now, if you ask the average medical doctor, explain that study, what's that all about? They really have a hard time with it because medicine separates the mind from the body. Western medicine separates the mind from the body. So we don't consider emotional factors in the onset of illness. And yet I'll be telling you that all chronic health conditions are actually related to emotional states, and particularly to what happens to people in childhood. So who gets cancer, who gets asthma, who gets multiple sclerosis, these are not accidental events. They have to do with childhood experiences. Because the biopsychosocial perspective says that the biology of human beings is shaped for a lifetime by the psychological and social environment. So a Canadian study here in Toronto actually, less than 2 years ago showed that if you abused as a child, your risk of cancer as an adult goes up almost 50%. Now, and this is after you've controlled for such factors as smoking or inactivity or other lifestyle issues. Biopsychosocial. Now, if you look back to the case of the child who's asthmatic, if anybody here has been treated for asthma, you know that how we treat asthma is with inhalers. So what happens in asthma is you get narrowing of the airways, so the bronchi, which are the airways, are surrounded by a smooth muscle, and the smooth muscle goes into spasm, so the airways narrow. And now you have air flowing through a narrowed tube, so you have the labored wheezing of the asthmatic. Making things worse is inflammation. So the airways get inflamed, they swell up, internally there's debris which further obstructs the flow of air. How we treat asthma is by means of inhalers that, number one, open up the airway, they relax those muscles, bronchodilators they're called, and furthermore we treat them with inhalers that suppress the inflammation so the airways can again be more open and conduct the flow of air. What you may not know is that the bronchodilator, the inhaler that opens up the airways, is actually a copy of adrenaline. And the anti-inflammatory is a corticosteroid, it's a copy of cortisol. Now, what are adrenaline and cortisol? Anybody here know? They're stress hormones. Adrenaline and cortisol are the stress hormones manufactured by the adrenal gland. Renal means kidney, adrenal means on top of the kidney. So the adrenal gland sits on top of the kidney here on both sides. It sets off, or it releases a number of hormones, primarily the hormone named after it, adrenaline. And just like the brain, the adrenal gland has a cortex. Cortex means bark, like the bark of a tree. And so the adrenal gland also secretes a hormone named after the cortex called cortisol. And cortisol and adrenaline are the hormones that our body, through the adrenal glands, secrete when you're stressed. So if I were to stress you right now, threaten you, or just emotionally upset you, your adrenal gland will be secreting adrenaline and cortisol, which would help you increase your heart rate, more energy, more oxygen to the muscles and to the brain. It would increase your blood pressure so that you're stronger. It would elevate your sugar levels so that you have more energy to fight or to escape. And those are the hormones that we treat asthma with. Now, what's actually happened here is that the normal stress response mechanism of the child whose parents are stressed has become exhausted. And now we have to give them extra stress hormones to keep their airways open. So that when children are overstressed, their natural stress response mechanism gets exhausted. Now keep that in mind, because if you look at which is the medication that's used most commonly in all of medical practice for eczema, for psoriasis, for asthma, for multiple sclerosis, for colitis, for Crohn's disease, for rheumatoid arthritis, for certain kind of cancers, what is it? It's cortisol, the stress hormone. But my profession never asks itself, if we're using stress hormones to treat everything, maybe stress has something to do with it? You know, it's an obvious question. And those mechanisms are set early in childhood, by the way. Those mechanisms are set early in childhood. So I'll be saying more about that towards the end of the day. But right now I'm just demonstrating for you the biopsychosocial model, which is to say that the biology is affected by the psychological and social environment. Now, this is in childhood. Is it true in adulthood? Well, you look at an Australian study, 500 women who had breast lumps suspicious for cancer. So they had to be biopsied. And before the results came back, there was a psychological interview, and after the results were collated, it turned out that if a woman had a major stressful episode in her life prior to the onset of that lump, that had zero effect on whether that lump was cancerous or not. Furthermore, if a woman was emotionally isolated, that also had zero effect. None at all. Okay. But if a woman had been emotionally isolated and had suffered a major stress in her life, the risk of that lump being cancerous was 9 times as great as the average. Now the researchers, being trained medical scientists, couldn't figure this one out, because their logical brain said, logically enough, how does 0 and 0 add up to 9? But that's because they don't get the biopsychosocial nature of phenomena. Now, if you, sir, were very stressed right now by something, your adrenal gland would put out the cortisol and the adrenaline, and your blood pressure would be high. By the way, what is the medical term for high blood pressure? Does anybody know? We think we don't know what causes high blood pressure. It's so laughable. It's almost laughable. What's the medical name for high blood pressure? Anybody know that? Hypertension. Think about it. Hypertension. These people have too much tension in their lives. That's why they have high blood pressure. Now, this is good in the short term because it helps you escape or to fight back. But in the long term, it damages the body. It causes heart disease, high blood pressure, strokes, and so on. Cortisol, in the long term, causes ulcers, makes you heavier on the belly so that you have more risk of heart disease, thins your bones, depresses you, and suppresses the immune system. So again, to come back to my example here, if a person here is stressed and they're all by themselves, they're emotionally isolated, nobody to talk to, and you've been in this situation where something's really upsetting you and you keep thinking about it and you keep thinking about it, you can just tell, you can feel the tension and the physiological disturbance in your body. And if there's nobody there to talk with, because you're emotionally isolated, it's going to be like that for months. So for months you're going to stew in your own stress juices. But that suppresses your immune system. No wonder that lump has a greater risk of turning cancerous, as compared with If somebody that you knew and trusted and had some empathy and intuition came and said, "Hey buddy, how you doing?" Puts a hand on your shoulder. "Do you want to talk about it?" What happens to you physiologically? Immediately, your physiology changes. Your heart rate goes down, your blood pressure goes down, you take a deep breath, oxygen goes to your brain. And physiologically, you're back in balance within a second. So that's why people who are emotionally isolated are more likely to fall ill. And lots of studies have shown that, by the way, that people who are emotionally isolated are more likely to fall ill. Which means to say that emotional contact is actually essential for health. And if this is true of children and adults, it's also true of old people. So there was a study in the New England Journal of Medicine just a few years ago that showed that in an elderly couple, if one of them is hospitalized, what do you suppose happens to the other one? They're more likely to fall sick, because the immune system of the one depends on the psychological and social relationship with the other. And that's just simply the biopsychosocial point of view. It's not controversial, it's straightforward, and yet it's completely ignored in medical practice. And it's completely ignored in pediatrics and in how we treat children. And yet the situation is that if this is true for adults in midlife or at the end of life, how much more is it true for children? Because the importance of psychological and social relationships in modulating your biology increases as your level of maturity decreases. So the more immature you are, the more you're dependent. And that's why infants who are fed but never picked up will actually die. They literally will stress themselves to death. And in the orphanages in Ceausescu's Romania, when they looked at these, because in Romania, under the Ceausescu dictatorship, abortions were not legal, and birth control was not all that well available. So, and it was terrible poverty. So people kept having children that they couldn't look after. So many children ended up in these terrible state-run orphanages where there was a very poor adult-to-child ratio. Well, sure enough, when you measured the cortisol levels of these kids, they were really elevated. But let me tell you a frightening statistic. In American studies, they looked at the cortisol levels of kids in daycares, and they were higher than the cortisol levels of the same kids at home. So that, although the Romanian example is an extreme case, we're also stressing kids in our society by the lack of relationship with adults. Because the more dependent you are, the more immature you are, the more you're requiring those psychological social relationships to maintain your internal physiological and biological balance. So that's the key here. Which also means that just to look at children and say that there's something wrong with the brain biology without looking at the psychological and social environment is to ignore the most important determinant of what's happening with them.